Welcome, good morning. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to the very first of the Spenard History Series. Very happy to announce that this is the very first collaboration between Beartooth and Spenard Second Saturday, and the first of many to come in the future. My name is Helena Sarcone, and I am one of the lead organizers of Spenard Second Saturday. And I want to start by giving a very big thanks to everyone who braved the roads to make it out here today. We really, really appreciate it, and we're really excited to share this with everyone. So just a first brief overview of Spenard Second Saturday. We are a volunteer-run neighborhood initiative that has been around for just over a year now. And we have a three-part mission of celebrating local businesses, championing the creatives, and giving back to the community. A couple of ways that we do this are through our quarterly partnerships. This quarter, we're partnered with Habitat for Humanity and also local artist Cha-Cha Flores. Cha-Cha has designed a limited edition Spenard Second Saturday sticker featuring Joe Spenard, and they are available out in the lobby for $5, and all proceeds are donated to Habitat for Humanity. As I mentioned, Spenard Second Saturday is a completely volunteer-run initiative, so if you are interested in volunteering, please touch base with Shirsha out in the lobby afterwards. But I'd like to give a huge thanks to everyone who made this possible today. First of all, thank you to Beartooth for donating the space, and for Adrian, the event coordinator, for being so supportive and flexible with scheduling. Also, thank you to Saoirse McPeak, who will be manning the table out in the lobby, Carrie Shepard for helping with marketing, Jesse Rosenstein for helping with a recording, so this will be available for all of us to watch again if we want to. Also, thank you to Thomas Korn and Thomas for helping with stage management. And last but not least, David Reamer for donating his time to come and talk about our beloved neighborhood. So even though David told me he wasn't into big introductions, I have a little bit of a blurb I'd like to share with you guys about him. David is an academic and public scholar interested in the intersections of social justice, history, and community construction. David is the co-author with Dr. Ian Hartman of the book Black Lives in Alaska, an African-American history of the far Northwest. His other publications include journal and magazine articles on topics ranging from Jewish Alaska history to baseball to waffles. And, of course, his Histories of Anchorage column, which appears weekly in the Anchorage Daily News, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. Current research topics include the presentation of history on social media and early LGBTQ history in Alaska. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome David Reamer.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here, especially on today, given today's road context. We did say beloved neighborhood, but this will be a bit of a darker history. There will be interludes mixed in, some of which are lighter, some of which are even darker. We'll get to the penguins. So, you all know Spenard. Spenard is this type of place where history often, maybe too often, sort of slides into legend, mixed with myth. The reputation of the community today is partially a history, it's partially a mix of the crime that has happened here. It's a mix of the spirit of independence that people say they have. It's a mix of tall tales. The memories of the pipeline boom and the accompanying excesses, balanced against public safety, the fears of crime, weighed against our respect for self-determination. And within that generally vague mythos of Spenard, the Spenard divorce stands out as strikingly distinct. Tragic in its origins, the Spenard divorce is the single greatest Spenardian addition to the local folklore. In its simplest form, a Spenard divorce, for those who've never heard it before, occurs when one spouse kills the other. An event that, according to the legends, according to the mythos, according to the idiom, according to the joke, happened far too often. And in most versions, it was the wife who killed the husband. A reversal of the sad Alaska standard on domestic violence. Raise your hands, how many of you have heard of a Spenard divorce before? Wow, that is far better than I expected. That's not counting hearing from like me on Twitter or something. All right. So it is an idiom. It's a defining Anchorage joke of its time. It is so funny. And in the way of myth and legends, there is a kernel of truth to it that was stretched into a story repeated as fact for its appeal to some and humor to others. Yes, some wives did shoot their husbands in Spenard, but how did that legend get there? How did that legend evolve into the idiom, into the joke, into pins, to stories? I'll be sprinkling in little bits of other Spenard history for context, mood, and just because I want to, because I have a captive audience and I want to talk about what happened to the penguins. This picture here, by the way, is part of the interludes. This was taken sometime around the early to mid-1950s. That's Spenard Road, headed towards Fireweed. The KFQD turnoff. KFQD was Northern Lights. It's called KFQD because of the radio station down at the terminus. Before that, it was called the Warrenzoff Road because I'm going to let you guess. And Alaskans have not always been very good at naming things. At least not very original. The concept of a Spenard divorce was The concept of a Spenard divorce was first defined in print in Robert Bowen's 1965 book, An Alaskan Dictionary. Published in Spenard, you look at it, you see where it was printed, it says Spenard, an independent Spenard. The text defined a Spenard divorce as a killing between a man and wife, a common form of dissolving the marriage union in Spenard, which is a suburb of Anchorage. See cabin fever. It's so funny. Bowen here is the descendant of a long lineage of humorists, people of renowned wit like Ambrose Bierce, the longtime San Francisco writer, who defined love as a temporary insanity curable by marriage. Bowen then said cabin fever was, in the long winters with little or no sun, and the thermometer running to 40 or 50 below zero, an isolated couple gets worn out with each other, whether they're trapping partners or husband and wife. We can be open. The result is cabin fever. The symptoms run from a man's refusing to talk to his partner for a month because the partner let the fire die out, to sleeping with a handgun under his head so the partner won't get him first. But Bowen did not invent that term whole cloth. He took it from what he heard around him. There was indeed a cluster of Spenard divorces-esque murders that all happened in early Spenard. On April 24th, 1959, Regina Bowker shot her husband 4 times within their Spenard trailer home. He died 3 years later. Alex was well known, her husband. He was a leader of the Alaska Commonwealth movement, which was this alternative idea in the 1950s that you could get as opposed to statehood, that you could get the benefits of statehood, but without that PEXI taxation. You may think like this would have gone over like gangbusters, but this was not popular. Commonwealth candidates were not elected, but there was this push in the 1950s. She killed them at their home, their trailer home, in the Vagabond trailer court that they owned and operated together. That trailer court was razed in the 1980s and became Northwood Park, if you're trying to place that. Also, on January 24th, 1960, Wilma Fern O'Neill shot her husband Joe through the back of the head in their Spenard trailer home. He was declared dead on arrival at Providence. She claimed no memory of the actual shooting, just a realization that her husband was dead at her feet. So then she went and told a neighbor. And on March 14th, 1965, Margaret Sims shot and killed her husband, Raymond, in their Spenard trailer home. The more clever amongst you will catch upon the trend. During the 1950s and 1960s, there were many other incidents of wives and girlfriends killing their partners in Anchorage and across Alaska, or trying to kill them. In 1954, a Kenai woman fired 6 shots at her husband from close range, from inside a car, but missed on all of them. The newspaper, the Anchorage Times here, went with the Annie Oakley comparison because it was funny. It was so funny. On July 26, 1957, Elmendorf Airman Orville Judd fired a single close-range shot from his .38 Special, killing his wife, Ruth Ann Judd, inside their Anchorage trailer home. The 18-year-old Ruth was leaning over their 2-month child. Neighbors heard the noise, looked outside. They saw Ruth's body partially tumbling out of the trailer home with her last steps. When police arrived, Orville was hysterical and had to be restrained, even sedated. At his court-martial, he claimed that he, through curtains of tears, he claimed it was an accident. He was dishonorably discharged and sentenced to 25, later reduced to 20 years of hard labor. In 1955, Altman Boatner shot and killed his wife in Fairbanks after she was, quote, being coy. She had denied him a kiss. In 1958, Betty Mahaffey shot and killed her husband in Kodiak. She offered no motive to the police, just said, I had to do it. I just had to do it. Even more color-free, in 1959, Elizabeth McIntosh fired several shots at her husband inside the downtown Anchorage Federal Building. This is the old Federal Building, just outside the courtroom. But no one ever made a joke about a Fairbanks divorce. No one called it a Kodiak divorce. No one said the downtown courthouse divorce. In the way that Spenard's domestic murders became known. The Bowker, O'Neill, and Sims murders captured the local imagination. They built upon this growing reputation of Spenard as a more lawless community, the flip side of the independence so many there thought that they needed more than anything. These Spenard murders established, supported, and perpetuated the concept of a Spenard divorce. Bowen was the first example of someone defining the term Spenard divorce in print, actually explaining the word. But the way these sort of things work is people say them but don't explain them first. They were just out there in conversation. From 1961 here, the ruling in the Regina Bowker murder case, the presiding judge said, "We hope we will not have any more of these Spenard divorces." I do not say this facetiously. People in this area are too free with guns. For many years, we have had too much use of firearms. This is the first use in print of the term Spenard divorce by a judge in a murder trial. While the term obviously existed in some form before this, the judge did not invent this out of whole cloth. He did not invent the murders. He did not invent the reputation of Spenard that this built upon. But this is a point that you can track it to. This trial, for its luridness, for a wife killing her husband in colorful Alaska. Everybody wanted those Alaska news, then, now, and forever, apparently. This coverage traveled all across the country. East Coast newspapers carried this story, carried this quote. People in New York City heard of Spenard divorce at this time. It's very likely this is how they first heard of Spenard. This quote was everywhere. In addition to this, being the first quote, establishing the term here would allow it to enter the local consciousness and build more and more into the form that Bowen could recognize 4 years later in print in his book. Also, a researcher at the Utah State Folklore Collection, very distinct, singular, but useful collection. One of their researchers was cataloging this term in 1972, and they were talking to some Alaskans, and their informant told them he had first heard the term in 1962. We have the term in print. We have these murders that happened. This term, we can be reasonably sure, originated in the very early 1960s. I titled this talk, The Matrimonial Murder on the Miracle Mile, because of alliteration. because Spenard Road used to be called the Miracle Mile, far, far more often than it is now. It is roughly a mile from Chester Creek to the lake, though I'm sure you've heard the term before, many times probably, advertising, people pointing it at you. It's primarily a relic of the 1950s. Where you really see it used is in the 1950s descriptions of Spenard, when there was a hope, even belief among many, that an independent Spenard would not just exist distinct from Anchorage, but would outshine, would outgrow, would crush old Anchorage until they themselves begged to be annexed into Spenard. That Spenard was the gem of the community, that they would be that beacon on a hill. Instead, that independence from authority brought with it many negatives. Packs of feral dogs, because the limited local government was not much bothered into action. Things that would have cost money to hire a dog catcher. When I say packs of feral dogs, I mean children died. I mean there were packs of dogs waiting outside of churches on occasion, outside of schools. Spenard became the vice headquarters of the Anchorage Bowl. Lots of different spots in Anchorage have had this honor before. The Park Strip, South Edition, Fairview. But Spenard has had the longest grasp upon that reputation. You know, the drugs, the massage parlors, the gambling, open prostitution, those even during the heyday of the 70s, those were available elsewhere in Anchorage, but they were easiest to get in Spenard. A miracle it was not. Also, as one of my interludes, today you would say people from Spenard were Spenardians, the demonym. In the 1950s, they were trying out something completely different, Spenarders, which has this very Midwest feel to me. You good old Spenarders, you can try it out, see if you can change that. Language can change. So if you go out there and just start calling everyone Spenarder, you tell people that's the real term. You write angry letters, you call in, to the radio station, you tell your politicians, don't refer to us as Spenardians, call us Spenarders. Maybe you can change something today. So in the early to mid 1960s, the term Spenard divorce was a full part of the local mythology. Bowen's book is this thin and short little document. But Brian Cooper included it in his 1973 survey of Alaska history, in which sort of legitimized it. This became the type of book that more serious people would quote. This became the book that other people would say, well, if Cooper said it. Cooper didn't know what the hell he was talking about, but he wrote, I heard the phrase Spenard divorce several times before it was explained to me by a lawyer. Spenard is a rather tough district of Anchorage, and it simply means that a woman shoots and kills her husband. It is assumed that she had a pretty good reason for doing so. And the normal sentence is 6 months suspended, if the murder is a first offense. Obviously, it must not become a habit. The sentence for a man is usually no more than a few years and might also be suspended, if you can prove undue provocation or self-defense. I think back to the man in Fairbanks whose wife was being coy. Regardless of Bowen, Cooper, or any other single author, by the late 1970s, the idiom was showing up in somewhat regular usage outside of Alaska. Usually an example of how unique life was here. This is what people came here, this is what they learned, this is one of the little colorful tidbits they took home with them to talk about Alaska. Did you hear that a wife can kill her husband in Anchorage? Those Alaskan people are crazy. It's so funny, it's colorful. When writing for an Iowan paper in 1978, Carl Hamilton reported, Spenard is an Anchorage suburb. A Spenard divorce in midwinter is the disposal of a spouse in some violent manner. So colorful. Said the Albuquerque Journal in 1985, quote, some couples have gotten an Alaska divorce with the closest firearm. These phenomena occur during what is called the snap. How funny. Somewhere along the way, people also started using Alaska divorce because, let's be honest, outside of Alaska, most people have no clue about Spenard, and the joke works better if you say Alaska. However, this type of usage is extremely rare and never comes across as very natural. The Spenard divorce then gets included in a few slang dictionaries. It's getting codified, it's being recorded. The historians have got a hold of it. Like this excerpt from Jim Crotty's 1997 book, How to Talk American. For some Americans living outside Alaska, a Spenard divorce, this was their expectation. If they came here, did they think they were going to see this happen? Did you know they're straight up allowing spouses to just shoot each other and walk away? So funny. And by the way, the fact that this book was published in 1997 and is describing Spenard as a suburb tells you exactly how much thought and actual research went into it. They just will accept these jokes about Alaska. An interlude again. One second. There we go. From the late 1970s through the early 1990s, there was this massive boom in stand-up comedy. Cable television expanded into American homes. There was both more demand and exposure. From 1978 to 1988, over 300 comedy clubs opened around the country. There was a lot more money in being a comedian, and coincidentally, a lot more comedians were needed to fill this space. There were spots open, if you could just have a tight 10 minutes. Anchorage was not left out of the boom, although in very Anchorage fashion, not in the most classy of ways. PJ's, aka Papa Joe's, was a strip club at Spenard and 36th, best known for the muscular dancer Pillow, who's lovely, who literally changed her name to that, to Pillow. PJ's opened in 1969 and closed in 2010 after raids for being, a front for cocaine dealing. Anyway, with no real alteration to its operation, PJ's jumped whole hog into the stand-up comedy business. Major comedians that you've heard of performed there, to their somewhat eternal shame. Jerry Seinfeld, Bob Saget, Damon Wayans, all of them admittedly long before they were big enough to avoid having to perform in Alaska. Among these comedians was Full House star Dave Coulier. Maybe you remember him as the early host of America's Funniest People, or as a voice actor on the cartoon Rude Dog and the Dweebs, which I just put here so I could say Rude Dog and the Dweebs in this space, and force you all to hear me say Rude Dog and the Dweebs. I don't even remember the show, I just like saying it. This excerpt is from the 2006 book, I Killed, which is a collection of road stories from comedians. It's a fun book. Coulier was here and had a heckler. Heckler pulled out a gun, waved it around, and said, "I'm gonna shoot your ass." Coulier, not an Alaskan, was a bit shaken by this encounter and retreated. Went to the bouncer. The bouncer was, no problem. Unless the bullet actually hits you, you got nothing to worry about. Spenard. There we go. Along the way, the term did evolve somewhat. In most of the earlier usage of the term, a Spenard divorce was when a wife killed a husband, which makes sense given the, inciting acts. As one old-timer said, we had an excellent custom called the Spenard divorce. Excellent custom. Which meant that if a wife or her children were abused by her husband, she pulled out her gun and rootity-toot, he was dead. Over time, it grew to include the murder of either partner in order to escape wedlock, or even just to get out of any intimate relationship, that had lasted too long and you saw, no other closer way to the door. Moreover, it is clear that a large part of the joke was that the Spenard divorce wasn't a crime at all, or barely a crime. The drawing on the left there is from the 1988 Alaska Dictionary and Pronunciation Guide, right next to the definition of Spenard divorce. The pin on the right was designed by Bill Sparrow Juneau. The bottom it says the X Frontier. He designed it over 30 years ago, but you can still buy them on his website. I have one I'll give away at the end here. In 1988, Sheila Toomey of the Anchorage Daily News divided Anchorage murders into two categories: Spenard divorces and serious crimes. Wrote Toomey, when one of Anchorage's 18 to 22 homicides a year turns out to be a mere Spenard divorce, throw everything you've got at it for 2 or 3 days around the clock. So, if it's a real divorce, a real murder, then try and solve it. But a Spenard divorce, not so much. In 1996, longtime columnist and politician Mike Dugan wrote, also for the Daily News, quote, once you've decided your spouse is cheating and you want a divorce, the most important question to ask is, if I have the right weapon, is a lawyer really necessary? So funny. This is Dugan again from his 1993 book, How to Talk Alaskan. As Spenard became primarily known for bars, the definition of Spenard divorce has moved out of the trailer home to fit its setting. Further now, more than 30 years from its origin, a Spenard divorce no longer necessarily even included the murder. As Dugan says, the rite is often conducted in one of the area's many watering holes. Since a Spenard divorce often involves alcohol, a surprising number end with all parties still breathing. We've come a long way from those murders in the trailer homes. I'm comfortable saying that by the 1990s at least, the term has ceased being a real, active, understood idiom. It has started to pass out of the regular lexicon. The people who had created it, grown up with it, knew the original context, had been there in the 70s. They were getting older, new people moving into Alaska. And the way you can sort of tell this is, starting around in the 1990s, whenever someone wrote about or made a mention to Spenard divorces, they had to include a definition. They couldn't just say, it was just an old Spenard divorce, and then continue the conversation. They had to say, it was a Spenard divorce, when a wife kills her husband and gets away with it. That's not an active piece of the lexicon. That's you having to explain it. The Anchorage population had changed, more than tripled since 1960 when those first murders had happened. The Spenard of the Miracle Mile was long gone, transformed into something different. This is the idiom's modern use. People discover it. They find how those crazy old people used to be in Alaska. They make their joke and they move on. What do a tornado and a Spenard divorce have in common? Someone's going to lose a trailer. It's funny. It's surprisingly historical accurate. We all laughed. Another interlude. Speaking of snow, I added this slide just for the occasion. This wasn't in there a week ago. I don't know why. Depending on how old you are and how far back, you have your idea of what the biggest snowstorm was. Some of you, it is right now. That's not a joke. Some of you will be talking about 2023 in years to come. You will remember bouncing on the road. You will remember what it was like to shovel it. You will remember that you forgot to go buy a shovel and you were using a box. You will remember your stories. Not me. PFD snowblower, baby. Some of you might remember the St. Patrick's Day Snow Massacre of 2002. Older ones of you might remember 1995. Some of you might remember the cold of 1989. The real tenured amongst you, if there are any, might really remember 1955, which is actually the record holder for storm and 6-day snowfall still. However, I'm going to tell you that there is one storm worse and greater than them all in a very specific way that almost certainly cannot be surpassed. In early January 1959, a storm passed through Anchorage that managed to eliminate the entire population of penguins in the state. What other storm do you know of that eliminated a species in an area? You want to know why there's penguins. In 1958, an eccentric an Italian radio personality decided Alaska needed penguins. He had heard too often, as everyone does in and outside of Alaska, Alaska has penguins, right? Why don't you have penguins? And if for no other reason than he thought this dissonance should be corrected, he sponsored a collection to get 2 penguins, transport them to Italy via Amsterdam to Anchorage. The Alaska Press Club got really into this idea. There was going to be a, quote, new nation of penguins in Alaska. The Alaska Press Club married the 2 penguins. The Alaska Press Club were not biologists. They were not zoologists. They did not know what they were doing. They married 2 lady penguins. This was the first legal gay marriage in Alaska. There would be no new nation. Now, the people who were forced to take care of the penguins hated the job. They hated the penguins. They thought they were idiots. They literally called them stupid repeatedly in the press. But penguins aren't used to the snow like we have right now. Antarctica's a desert. These penguins probably actually came from islands. But penguins don't live through 2 feet of snow. That's not what they do. Through a snowstorm. So when it snowed one day in January 1959, a particularly wintry snap, they froze. With their beaks open and their mouths filled with snow, they drowned and froze at the same time. And that is why 1959 is the worst snowstorm of ever in Anchorage. I told you some of the interludes are actually worse. So, back to Spenard divorces. People tell those jokes. They were hilarious. We all laughed. And they repeated those legends for decades. But were they true? Could women get away with murder? Do you think so? Could women get away with murder in Alaska? In Spenard, if anywhere? Now, no, women are not allowed to get away with murder in Alaska or any part of it. Women, shockingly, were fully arrested and charged. I believe that Regina Bowker, who killed her husband Alex in 1959 and was one of the initial basis of the Spenard divorce idiom, she shot her husband Alex 4 times, once in the bedroom, then 3 more walking through the hallway of their trailer and into the bathroom. When the state troopers arrived, Alex actually said, "Don't punish her for this. I don't know why she did it." He knows what he did. However, an Anchorage police officer testified that Regina said, "He pushed me too far. I just kept pulling the trigger." I like that line too. I saw it. I saw you go, wow. The jury found her guilty of second-degree murder, and Superior Court Judge Edward Davis, the same man who said we can't have any more of these Spenard divorces, sentenced her to 15 years in prison, noting, "I don't believe Mrs. Bowker is going to go out and shoot someone else. On the other hand, I have a duty to the community at large." The conviction was upheld on appeal. None of my original examples got away with murder. In 1960, Wilma Fern O'Neill shot her husband Joe through the back of the head at their Spenard trailer home. He was declared dead on arrival at Providence. 3 days after that shooting, another woman appeared at the Anchorage police station claiming that she had actually married him in 1944 and they had never divorced. Wilma was found guilty of murder in the first degree, the first such conviction for anyone, man or woman, in Anchorage since 1949, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. They treated this crime seriously. They were making examples of these women. In 1965, after Margaret Sims shot and killed her husband Raymond in their Spenard trailer home, police found 7 spent cartridges by the body. While out on bail, she remarried her first husband and began styling herself as Margaret Sims Mossberg, Sims being the name of the second husband that she had just killed. She initially pled innocent to charge of first-degree murder before accepting a deal where she pled guilty to a second-degree murder charge. She was sentenced to a 15-year prison stint with 8 years suspended. Even the Kenai woman, the Annie Oakley, who fired 6 times at her husband, we all laughed, she couldn't get away with nearly killing her husband. She was fined $200 for, quote, flourishing, pointing, and discharging a gun in a public place. I mean, it was actually their car, but that $200 is about $4,700 in today money. That is the way, so often, of myth and legends, that this kernel of truth had been stretched into the more pleasing story. Why talk about doing a murder unless, in your version of the joke, you get away with it? So, why did it evolve this way? Why did it evolve into this version that wives or husbands could get away with murder? So, another interlude. Can you get away with murder in Alaska? Of course you can, whether woman or man, although it's easier if you are a man, and I'll give you an example. Charlie Cannon was a somewhat notable musher in mid-century Alaska, trapper and guide. In 1953, he and his dog team took part in the presidential inauguration parade. They all went to D.C., they were all down there, everybody took their pictures. He was Alaska famous. In early 1955, he and his wife Ruth were having a bit of argue at their house out by Lake Louise, by Glen Allen. They argued, he went out for a bit, he came back, she was still not talking, very dramatically pulled up a book, according to his version of events, pulled up a book and would not look at him, would not speak. So he walked in front of her and shot her dead. For months he spread a story that she had left him, and that if anything, if only someone would help him find his poor wife. Law enforcement was a bit suspicious. There weren't exactly a lot of other suspects at Lake Louise in the winter. No one else said they flew in there. So they had him in for a lie detector test, back when that was still, Holy Bible. He failed, and then without any evident emotion, he never would show any emotion over the next several months, provided a full signed confession. He not only admitted to the murder, but he took a collection of police officers out for a field trip and reenacted it at Lake Louise. He walked them through the process. When he killed her, he burned the body up, and then he built a smokehouse on top of where he burned the body. Then he took those ashes and he spread them out over the frozen lake. So when it melted, when the spring came, all the evidence was gone. The police were impressed. They literally is quotes from the officer saying he knew what he was doing. But something happened. He talked to a lawyer, who knows what, but he reneged on the confession, started saying no, that was a lie. Goes to the grand jury. The grand jury chooses not to indict. No true bill. He walks away a free man. He confessed to the murder. There were no other suspects. He showed them where. He showed them how. He walked them through it. He made a play of it. They were impressed. He walked away a free man. You may wonder, did this stick to him then? This was a very public murder thing. Nope. He was still a very public and prominent musher. He was a timekeeper for Fur Rondi. He was still a very Alaska famous man. And by all appearances, there of course could have been more subtle isolation. But from appearances, there were no repercussions at all, neither legally nor socially. Quite simply, Alaska is one of, if not the most dangerous states for women. As regards intimate partner violence and sexual assault, Alaska ranks somewhere between third worst and worst state for women, depending on how you look at it. And within Alaska, Anchorage and Fairbanks are usually listed among the most dangerous cities for women in the country. And deeper than that, smaller Alaska communities have far worse rates of intimate partner violence, sexual assault. Women disappear without investigation. Per the most recent data, 2020 Alaska Victimization Survey conducted by the University of Alaska Justice Center, 7 out of 10 adult Alaskan women reported experiences of intimate partner violence, of abuse, which include actual physical violence, psychological aggression, coercive control. For each of the three murders that were the basis of the Spenard divorce idiom, the women made serious public claims of intimate partner violence. Alex Bowker repeatedly cheated on his wife, Regina. A week before shooting him, she filed for divorce, citing his cruel and inhumane behavior towards her. On the day of the shooting, they argued over selling that trailer park. According to Regina, her husband threatened to commit her to a mental asylum, saying, quote, "I will make you sign these papers. I will get you out of here one way or another." She testified to that fact. Wilma Fern O'Neill claimed her husband beat her and their 4 children from the previous marriage, which again, he almost certainly did not get a divorce from. And on that specific day of the murder, they had argued over what she said, quote, "rather bizarre ideas on sex practices." And Margaret Sims says that when she asked for a divorce, her husband laughed in her face and ignored her. The Kenai woman, the Annie Oakley that we all laughed at, shot 6 times. In that same article, in that same one that opened up with the Annie Oakley joke for the headline, we're only talking like a 3-paragraph long article. The author notes that she was visiting some friends when her husband entered, beat her, and dragged her out and into the car where the shooting then occurred. Again, these weren't hidden details. These were out there. These were in the press. These were not court documents or letters or diaries. Literally in the press, in the articles, on the front page most often. The Annie Oakley article, front page. Not hidden. Everybody was reading the paper in these days, by the way. These details, the outcome, the sentencings, the fact that these people were sent away for long periods of time, these were public and widely reported. The circumstances were still twisted in joke, a locally funny idiom, and by laughing at it, a joke neuters its subject of its power. If I stand in front of you and I laugh at you, I'm making a judgment call over how much impact you can have on me. And one of the interesting things about these local idioms, these local jokes, they are by definition exclusionary. Otherwise, you would use language that everybody knows. If you know, then you know. If you don't know, well, then you don't belong, you're not from here. Shibboleths like this, they divide outsiders and newcomers from the entrenched locals. So in that way, knowing of Spenard divorces, then you get the joke, then you laugh at the idea of women striking back, of wives killing their abusers, would have proved that you were a real Alaskan because you got the joke. You knew why it was funny. But there is an even darker takeaway. In this conclusion, consider the abusive context of the incidents that inspired the joke. Consider Alaska's long-standing status towards public safety for women. And consider the structure of the joke itself, how it's always phrased, that you get away with murder and that this is the way out of a relationship. On its own, its history, its context, its structure, the Spenard divorce suggests that the way, perhaps only way, out of an abusive, intimate relationship is by the death of a partner. So let's end on a lighter note. If the legends of the Spenard divorce are as bleak and ahistorical as I described them, then are there any Spenard legends that are true and that won't make you, ruin your afternoon? Yes. This is from the February 23rd, 1932 Anchorage Daily Times. The Lake Spenard Road was impassable due to snow. Again, people just named the roads by where they ended up. Nobody was original. Neither cars nor school bus could make it through. But the children out there south of Chester Creek, the homesteaders and the farms, they were still required to show up to class. The article notes, it does not mean that all of the children living along the road are going to stay at home. They are going to walk to and from town as long as weather conditions will permit and until the road is plowed out. And by weather conditions to permit, this included being too deep of snow for cars or buses to pass. So perhaps your grandparents, great-grandparents, people you know around that age. They really did have to walk to school in the snow when the road itself was impassable for miles and miles, down and up a hill all the way into town. Thank you. I think we took too much time today, so we're going to end now. I have a few Alaska items. The first people up here, I will hand them to you. I have some vintage Alaska hats, postcards, books, one of my books that I co-wrote, and an Alaska board game. Please come see me at the end wherever I am floating around. I thank you for coming. I appreciate you coming. Hopefully this can be the start of something. Thank you so much.